We're going to talk about the children's book that isn't really meant to be read by kids because it's hard and it's full of wisdom and stuff that kids just don't get. We're talking about The Hobbit. Welcome to the Chad Garrett Show. This episode is brought to you by Liberty Eagle Apparel. If you want 100% patriotic, 100% American-made clothing that is quality to boot, make sure you go over to www.libertyeagleapparel.com and use promo code FORERUNNER at checkout for 10% off of your order. All right, so last time that we were together, we talked about the entire expanse of history leading up to the Lord of the Rings series, except for like the events of The Hobbit. That is what we are about to dive into today, but a quick recap. Iluvatar is the god of all things. He has the Valar sing the world into existence. Then one of the Valar, Melkor, decides that he's going to put evil and darkness into it. He destroys the lamps. He destroys the trees. The fruit of the tree of one of the trees becomes the sun. The flower of the tree becomes the moon. Melkor, also known as Morgoth, steals some really fancy jewelry, launches a war called the War of Wrath. The end of the War of Wrath banishes Morgoth and ends the first age of Middle-earth. The second age of Middle-earth ends with the destruction of Sauron for the first time after he helped Numenor get destroyed and make the world round, which is why only elven ships can reach the far west now, known as the Utter West in the Legendarium. Then you have Isildur take the ring, and instead of destroying the ring, he decides he's going to keep the ring, and then the ring escapes him and gets lost into some murky waters somewhere near Mirkwood-ish. And that's the last thing that we hear about the ring. Okay? We're all caught up now. It was in this 1,000-ish year period at the beginning of the Third Age when hobbits first arrived in Middle-earth. Nobody really knows where they came from or what they're doing there. Everyone assumes that they were another creation by Iluvatar, what have you. This is important because they came to Middle-earth from the east, not from the west. And so they crossed past the Lonely Mountain, through Mirkwood, across the Misty Mountains, into what is known as Eriador. Now, it is during this time period of the spread of Hobbit kind that you get Smeagol's race. That is why this is important, is because Smeagol is of the race of hobbits. He is a type of hobbit before the hobbits found the Shire. And Smeagol is the one that finds the One Ring. Anyone that knows anything about the Lord of the Rings knows that Smeagol finding the One Ring and becoming Gollum is like quintessential to this whole thing. However, now that I've done a recap of history and we are at the events of The Hobbit, I want to talk about the book of The Hobbit first. Number one, it's written as a children's book, but it's not exactly meant to be read by children. This is the type of children's book that you read to your kids, not that you have your kids read. And the reason being is because there's elements of speech, there are repetitive elements that are whimsical, that are intended to be whimsical, but you have to be looking for that intention in order to get it. Kids that pick this book up and read it, I can attest, I would know, I tried it when I was younger, don't get it. You don't really understand it unless you have someone who is older who does understand it, read it to you and add all the right inflection and make sure that they emphasize the right parts and make sure that they explain things to you. So it's the children's book that's not exactly meant to be read by children. It's meant to be read to children. A couple of things that make this book so whimsical. First one is it has like traditional magic. When Bilbo tries to reach in and grab the purse of the ogre in the first quarter of the book, the purse actually screams at Bilbo. This is something that we don't get in the movies that Peter Jackson came back and made a little bit later. It's not what we've come to know from Tolkien when it comes to magic. Tolkien's magic is very mysterious. We don't know exactly where it comes from or how it's manifested or how you become good at it. Oftentimes, we don't see Gandalf conjuring magic unless it's a light or him like coming down out of nowhere whenever he arrives in the middle of the Fangorn Forest. And the magic that we do see, there's no hard rules. It's what is known as a soft magic system. There's no hard rules. We don't really know how it works. All we know is that it exists, and some people are really good at it. The ogres that has like the screaming purse, all of them actually have like traditional English names. They don't have like Azog the White. You don't have these weird names, the Urukai, right? Like, you don't have these weird names going on. The ogres, which should, you would think, have weird names, don't. They have English names, and that's because it makes it easier for kids to understand, and it makes it kind of funny to be able to, laugh at somebody with one of those names later on down the road. At one point, Gandalf actually, this isn't a whimsical thing, this is something that allows kids to relate to some of the principles that are in this book. When Gandalf talks about Radagast the Brown, he says that he has a cousin. Technically, we talked last week about the Maiar. The Maiar are technically not blood related. Radagast would have also been one of the Maiar. He is of the same order as Gandalf. They are both wizards. They have taken a certain path as being a Maiar and being one of these lesser primordials. But they are not actually family. And the reason why it's written that way is so that kids sort of get this grasp of there is a deeper connection between Gandalf and Radagast than just magic and wizardry. However, there is no real blood familial relation there. The Maiar don't have blood familial relations, really. That's something that the men and the elves and the other races have. And the last one is that the orcs and the goblins that are in The Hobbit don't seem to have any allegiance to any of the darker forces that are moving in the world at this time, namely the shadow of Sauron being the necromancer in Dol Guldur. However, they are extremely active, and they just want to see the world burn for the sake of the world burning. And that is indicative to this idea that there are some creatures out there, there are some beings out there that don't have a reason for being evil. They just are. We can't explain why. We can't explain how. We don't even know if we can change it. Most of the time we can't. And nevertheless, it happens. No matter how good or how much good is done, there's always going to be this arrival of evil into the world. And so this unallied evil force, though it sort of goes against the grain of most of what Tolkien does, is very, very much intended to speak a message. Now, it also has extremely repetitive elements. At the end of like 15, 16, 17, 80 different paragraphs, Bilbo says he was missing home greatly and not for the last time. He was missing home greatly and not for the last time. He was missing home greatly and not for the last time. As Bilbo is going along his journey, he really misses the Shire. Like, he really, really wants to go back to the Shire. But there are more repetitive elements than that. There are things like how polite people are, and there are things concerning how repetitive they take meals and the rituals around the meals and how they talk to each other that are all repetitive in every chapter, and it's intended to do something, and we'll talk about what. The last thing is that all of this is heavily influenced by Beowulf. There are direct parallels to the legend of Beowulf that are drawn in The Hobbit. Everything from 13 beings going out, or people essentially going out on a quest for great treasure, to a moment of supreme weakness in several characters that's reflected, and the wandering off of the path, Bilbo going to find the ring, and then coming back and lying to Gandalf about it. And then you have Thorin getting a hold of the Arkenstone, being changed by it, not actually just a shoehorned in piece. There's a really important part that sort of seals the doom of Thorin. Everything has almost a direct mirror to Beowulf, and that's not exactly surprising. I actually have on my shelf, on a different shelf than what you see behind me, not that shelf, different shelf, I have on my shelf a copy of Beowulf where Tolkien attempted to translate Beowulf into iambic pentameter, Beowulf being the epic poem of Old English. Tolkien didn't succeed in translating this thing into iambic pentameter, but what he did succeed in is getting a prose edition of Beowulf translated that captures a lot of that rhythmical element. What is the point? Why do we care about reading The Hobbit other than the fact that it tickles my fancy because you guys asked me to do a Lord of the Rings series? The answer is two-part. Impart wisdom on kids, and then set the stage for the War of the Ring, okay? So part of it has directly to do with like tickling my fancy because it's Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's cool and all of this stuff is extremely fascinating. And the second part of it is like actually imparting wisdom. And so this episode is going to be less about the plot of the book and more about the wisdom that is imparted through the book. And I've touched on it a little bit already, but I want to make sure to drive this home. The point of writing a children's book for anyone that writes a children's book is to somehow impart values and morals and wisdom on those kids that they can then take into the crappy age known as being a teenager, and then eventually emerge on the other side of that immensely dark pit with some element of virtue and morality and ethics about you that you can take into your adult life and be productive with. That being said, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how Bilbo leaves the Shire. When Bilbo is first approached, Gandalf has this innate sense that Bilbo is seeking adventure based on the way that Bilbo takes walks throughout the Shire, some of the stories that Bilbo wonders about. The book even talks about how Bilbo, in his own fashion, wonders what is out there beyond. He wonders what is going on in the world outside of the Shire. It's sort of an uncouth question to be asking if you're a hobbit, and nevertheless, he asks it, and this is one of the things that brings Gandalf to his door. Now, when Bilbo rushes out of the door, he does it in a flurry, and he's almost not able to think about it because of the contract and how everything worked out with the dwarves leaving early and him oversleeping, having been tired from hosting all of them, and only to find that his house was put back together in perfect order because the dwarves are extremely polite. Once again, little tidbit of wisdom there. If you go to someone else's house and you make a mess, help them clean it up. When Bilbo leaves the Shire, the big point of wisdom that he keeps hearkening back to, he talks about how often Bilbo says that he was missing home. He's missing home. He's missing home. The reason why is to impart on kids that home is something to be desired, not something to run away from. That we all need to put down roots somewhere, and somewhere that we can desire to go back to, a place that no matter how long we decide to chase the wind, we know we have a home at. And so when we see people today moving from place to place to place so frequently and picking up and putting down and picking up and putting down for a job or because they're trying to get out of a bad situation or because of the military making the move, it's a difficult life, feeling like you never have a place to belong. And for a long time, there was a really bad stigma against drifters. People didn't want some weirdo coming in from out of town that wasn't going to stay for very long, was going to mess up the nice order and peace that they had in their town and then move on. Nowadays, it seems like it's almost the norm to move from city to city every 5 years. Thankfully, the stigma against drifters is more or less gone, but except for in I would argue the super rural areas of the world. But still, I think that we have forgotten the significance of home. And this is directly reflected in some of the politics that we see happening in the United States today. Because we don't look at the United States as home, and we're so used to picking up and moving and going and doing and going and going and doing, and I want to go to Europe this year or Japan next year or wherever it is, you forget to have an allegiance for a place that is actually supposed to be significant in your heart, where you know that you belong, and no matter how far you wander, it is a place that you can return to. The next piece of wisdom that we get into has directly to do with Bilbo's growth. Brave people are not born brave. They become brave. If you're never in a position to be brave, your bravery begins to atrophy. It's sort of like a muscle. You've got to flex it. And if you're never put in a position to exercise bravery, then you don't exactly ever have a chance to discover what bravery is or what bravery means. You have to experience it somewhere. And the best way to do that, because in modernity, we don't have to be brave all the time. We're in a very sheltered society that has a lot of benefits to it, to the point where the ideas of having to brave the wilderness or to brave a tyrant, things of that nature, don't exist anymore. And yet we are still required bravery and courage and virtue. And it is more imperative that we have these things today than ever because of the reach of things like social media and the digital platforms. The world is easier to access. And so that means that there are more openings for bad actors and evil things to take place. If you don't have bravery, how are you going to stand up against it? Bilbo experiences this on his journey because up until this point, he's had an extremely comfortable life. And now he's asked to go out on an adventure, and he doesn't know what that means. But as he goes on this adventure, he realizes what it means to be brave. Everything from helping with the ogres to coming to the aids of the dwarves whenever they are imprisoned in Mirkwood by the wood elves, to going and facing off Smaug alone. This is all a part of Bilbo's growth. He has to be put in these positions to learn the virtue that he has in his own heart. The biggest one happens whenever he's in Mirkwood, and the dwarves are lost because they've been having these visions of the elves having parties in the woods, and those spiders end up ensnaring them and tangling them. And this is extremely important because this moment where Bilbo has only sort of stumbled on bravery up until this point makes the choice to use the ring, put on his big boy pants, and go do the right thing and save his friends. Now, how does that work in modernity? Where can we apply this today? My answer for this is going to shock you. It's actually with this whole radical racial movement that's happening right now. So many people want to throw up a Black Lives Matter sign, or so many people want to put up the black fist, or want to stand up for intersectional gay rights or whatever. Okay, fine. But you have to show me the boogeyman. And here's the thing that grabs me about this. People are so quick to run to their phones and to take a picture or a snapshot of them saying, I'm so happy that we're doing all of this because this is bringing awareness to people that have been oppressed for so long. How do you know they're oppressed? Have you experienced it? Have you seen it? If you haven't seen someone be oppressed, then you're taking someone else's word for it, in which case you should be asking this same question. Where is it at? Show me. And the people that have experienced it, the next question is, why didn't you stand up and say something then? If you see this happening and you do nothing, you are a part of the problem. Going and looting and burning cities down isn't the solution to this thing. It's individual people doing a brave thing and standing up for the right thing in this racial existence that we happen to be in because humans suck. But getting on your social media account and decrying it because someone else says that you should so that you can get some clout and because it makes you feel good by virtue signaling does nothing for anyone. Show some real courage and actually stand up for someone that you see being oppressed. And if you can't see it, ask where it's at so that you can go find it. And if you can't find it, it doesn't exist. Empirical data, a system where you go out and check it and try and find it, not create it, but try to find it. If it does not come back, that does not mean go and create it. And that's the whole issue with the anti-racist movement. The next piece of wisdom that we get from Bilbo is kindness to all. And this is really highlighted with Bjorn. Now, Bjorn's the shapeshifter, and in order to gain a place in his house, they're always nice to each other. Even when they're mad at each other, they're always nice to each other. And they're really trying to push this idea of like, be nice, be kind, be nice, be kind. Even when you're mad, there's a way that you can do something that is still nice, and it is still kind, and it is still handled in such a way that has an element of virtue and ethics to it, right? It's not about what you say, it's about how you say it. But when it comes to Bjorn, they go to this guy's house and they knock on the door and like, we need a place to stay. So we're going to like overwhelm this guy with kindness. Not only are we going to we're going to try and not overwhelm him with people. So we're going to have you all trickle in. And when you trickle in, be super duper nice to this guy. And so in this scene, you have this comical scene where 2 by 2, every pair of this party of 13 people come in, and they just start telling Bjorn like how great he is and trying to keep him intrigued with this story. And Bjorn's like so invested in the story that Gandalf keeps trying to tell that he keeps getting interrupted in by having more people arrive. And Bjorn gets frustrated and it's just like, I know you're being nice to me, but sit down and shut up so I can finish the story. But he doesn't say it like that. He's still nice to these people. This brings me to the most quintessential point of wisdom in the entire book. When passing through Mirkwood, Bilbo and the party are beginning to lose hope. They're out of food. They're starting to despair. The big fat one of the hobbits gets lost in a pool of water, and so he like gets insomnia, or not insomnia. He's like falls fast asleep, and they have to like carry him everywhere. And then whenever he like finally wakes up, he can't remember anything, and he's like constantly distracted and running around. And since he's the biggest one out of all of them, he wants to eat the most. It's wild. They're at this point of great despair. Like, we don't know how close we are to getting out of this thing. We've been going forever, and so they're like, Bilbo, climb a tree and tell us how far we've got left to go. So Bilbo climbs the tree, and he looks out, and he says there was no end. He had no idea how much farther they had to go. The forest had no end. They were completely lost. They must have been going in the wrong direction. And Tolkien gives us this little piece of insight. That the tree that Bilbo climbed up was in a valley. And so when Bilbo looked out about him, it looked like there was everything sprawling out because he wasn't elevated up above them. His perspective was skewed. And that if the dwarves and the party had just kept going, if Bilbo and the dwarves had just kept going, they would have made it out that day. They were so close to the edge. But because they were in a valley, a literal valley, and they were also in the valley of their own despair, they could not see the end. They couldn't see the way out. And this is great for us, because when we're in a valley, when we're in a place of our deepest, darkest despair, is usually when we're closest to a breakthrough. It's typically the time where you should push harder. When you get down, when you think that the end is nigh, that you're going to die, or that everything that you've been working for is, not to be melodramatic there, but that everything that you've been working for is coming to a close and that you're not going to succeed, that's the time to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get it done. Find a second wind, and this is what I call crush the coward. There's this idea that there's a coward inside of all of us that tells us to quit, that tells us that we're not good enough, that's scared of what might happen if you go and you try and push yourself a little bit harder. You're scared of what might happen, that you might actually fail. It's that little voice in the back of your head saying, maybe you shouldn't do it. Maybe you shouldn't do this. Maybe this isn't the right thing for you. That's a coward. Kick him in the face, put him in the dirt, pick yourself up, and keep going, because you're almost there. You're almost at that breakthrough. That's the point that you keep pressing forward, because if you don't, you're going to get lost. And finding your way out of that forest, of that darkness, is so much harder when you completely give up hope. And that's what we see happen in this too. It's the exact same thing that we see happen. That's what it leads to the spiders capturing the party. It's what leads them to getting captured by the elves after Bilbo rescues everybody. You have to push through and make it out the other side. And the last piece of wisdom is that people can become lost in their ambition. We see this with Bilbo lying about the ring, and this is where we come into the parallels with Beowulf. You see this heavily with Bilbo. When he escapes with the ring, originally he lies to Gandalf about how he got it. And even in the first writing of what is known as the Red Book of Westmarch, which is written by Bilbo for The Hobbit, and then The Lord of the Rings was the one that was written by Frodo. In the movies, it's the thing that Frodo closes up after he finishes writing it, and it's the book that Bilbo says that he wants to finish writing. It's the Red Book of Westmarch. In the original writing, Bilbo lies. He lies to Gandalf. He lies to just about everybody about the ring. He tries not to let anybody know, and this little trinket becomes his source of courage, even though that we know it's evil. His ability to have a little bit of power and wanting people to think himself braver and more powerful than he was led Bilbo to lying about something. He let his ambition to be seen as needed and necessary in the group to override his integrity. And this leads eventually to the direct events of The Lord of the Rings. The entire 6-book series of The Lord of the Rings is caused because Bilbo didn't have integrity in this moment. Now, we'll talk next week a little bit about sort of the salvation of Bilbo in that very same respect. But now I want to talk about the same parallel that happens with Thorin and the Arkenstone. Thorin finds the Arkenstone. He becomes greedy, starts to deny all of the little bits and pieces of gold that he could have given away. And if he would have been a better ruler and not been so greedy and corrupted by the Arkenstone, he probably would have not only kept the Lonely Mountain, but a lot of the gold there was in there and his life. Because Thorin was killed in the Battle of Five Armies. At the moment of his victory, he lets his ambition get the better of him, and in doing so, completely throws away all reward that he could have had. All of the experience of ruling and being better, gone. Because of greed, and he let his ambition get a hold of him. Beowulf experiences this same thing. And I bring this up because this is the parallel that Tolkien derives from all of this, is that when Beowulf went to go see Grendel's mother and kill Grendel's mother, Grendel was one of the first monsters that Beowulf kills. He goes to see and kill Grendel's mother, and in doing so would proclaim himself king. And instead of killing Grendel's mother, he sleeps with Grendel's mother. He's tricked. And the thing that Beowulf finds the most abhorrent of all men is men that are weak and cowardly, men that are not strong and full of conviction. And yet it is his very conviction that he just gives up because his weakness is women, sirens. He still ends up doing the right thing. He still ends up winning. He ends up killing the dragon that is born of his love with Grendel's mother, and still becomes the legend that we know today. He does choose to do the right thing, but his ambition gets the better of him, and it is what causes much of the heartache that happens in Beowulf. Okay, that's all we have for this episode. Next week, we are going to be talking about the first book in the Fellowship of the Ring. I really hope that you guys will join me for that episode. If you guys want something more, make sure you check out the Shelter Hole episodes every Tuesday. That's right, the Shelter Hole is coming to you every single Tuesday. You can check him out on Spotify. You can check him out at the Shelter Hole YouTube page. Also, make sure you head over to the Forerunner Productions YouTube page or the Forerunner Productions channel and check out Impetus Minds of the Driven, where we get behind the minds of some of the most driven people in our society and talk about what makes them driven and what has led them to the success that they have. Until then, I'm Chad Garrett, and this is The Chad Garrett Show.
Thank you.